Alright guys, welcome to the next video of Learn the MERN Stack. So I apologize if the last video was a little confusing. If you've never used Redux before, it probably was. And I take some responsibility for that, but a lot of it is just Redux is very, very difficult to explain to someone that has never used it before. Not so much the idea of it and what and how state management works and moving state from the component to, you know, a global store or whatever, but just the boilerplate setup, how to create like the types and how to dispatch to the reducer. It just gets very friggin' confusing, at least for me. I don't know, maybe I explained it fine and you completely understand it, but it was really hard for me to learn, and it's even harder to try to explain. But I think as we move along, as you see me add more actions and more stuff to the reducer, that it's going to make a little more sense. So at least that's what I'm hoping. So now the problem is we're listing this stuff. It's coming from our global state or our application state, but we can't delete because it's still looking for basically the component state. It's looking for the stuff in the component. Same thing with add item. If we try to add an item, that's not going to work either because this .state.items is now null. It's no longer there. We deleted it and moved it to Redux. So what we're going to do now is go back to the shopping list component. And by the way, we no longer need the UUID here. We can delete that import. We were just using that for the state that we had in the component. But what we want to do, I'm going to work on the delete first. So we're going to have an action. We'll go ahead and bring it in, even though we haven't created it yet, but it'll be called delete item. Okay, so we'll bring that in with get items, and any action you bring in, you're also going to want to put down here in this object. So we want to say delete item, and then that'll be accessible to us with this.props.delete item. So before we go ahead and try to use that anywhere in the component, let's create it. So we'll go to our item actions. I'm going to just copy this export const get items, and we're going to change this to delete item. Okay, now this is going to actually take in an ID because it needs to know which item to delete, and then the type is no longer going to be get items, it's going to be delete item. Now what we're doing here when we return is we're returning to the reducer. Okay, so we're going to check for delete item just like we checked for get items. And this also needs to know the ID that we're going to be deleting. It needs to know which one. So what we have to do is send a payload along with this dispatch or with this return, and it's going to be that ID. Okay, so it's the ID that gets passed in. So we'll save this. You can see my parentheses disappeared because I'm using the prettier extension, and when you have an arrow function that only has one parameter, prettier you don't need to have these parentheses. If I had more than one, like if I had two like that and I save, it's not going to get rid of them. But since there's only one, I don't need the parentheses, and prettier gets rid of it. That's all that happened there. So in my reducer, what I want to do now is add a case for delete. So case delete item. And then what we want to do here is pretty much the same thing that we did within the component. Remember, we did the filter. So we want to return, geez, if I can spell. No, we want to return the state. Now we want everything that is currently in the state. That's where the spread operator comes in. So we want to put our 3 dots and then the state. And then we want to take the items and let's say state.items and .filter. Okay, and so this is, remember, we did this inside the actual component, which I can show you right here. So we're going to do this same thing, right? Except it's not in the component, it's in the reducer, it's in Redux. So I'm going to just copy, I can just copy this whole line actually, and then go to our reducer and just paste in that whole line. Now instead of I need a comma here. Instead of this being just ID, we need to change this because it doesn't know what ID is. Now remember, in our action we passed in a payload. So this payload we can access with action.payload, just like we can get action.type in our reducer. That's what we're checking, action.type. So we want to check action if it's equal to action.payload, like that. And that'll be the whatever ID is passed in. So let's go ahead and save this and then go back to our component. And instead of doing what we've done here, we want to change this up. So instead of you know what we're going to do is we're going to create a separate function. Instead of doing it in here, because this is kind of messy, we're just going to set this to a function. So on click will equal this dot on delete click. Now this on delete click, it needs to take in the ID. It needs to know what ID to delete. So the way that we can pass it in is by doing a bind. We can say dot bind, and the first parameter will be this. The second one will be ID. So that way we can actually grab the ID, which actually comes from here. Okay, so let's go up here and create that method. So on delete click, and let's make that an arrow. Okay, and this on delete click takes in the ID, and then all we want to do is call the delete item action, this right here. Okay, so remember we access it with this dot props dot delete item, and then we're simply going to pass in the ID. All right, so we'll save that. And just to reiterate, when we click the delete button, it's going to call on delete click. It's going to pass the ID in, which comes in right here. And then we're going to call the action delete item, pass in the ID, which is this here. Okay, pass the ID in. It's going to get sent to the reducer along with the payload. And then in the reducer, we're going to do the same thing we did before with the filter, except we're using action.payload, which should include the ID. So let's try everything out. Hopefully we can delete an item. Let me make sure there's no errors down here. So UUID is not defined. UUID is not defined, and we're probably getting that because when we add an item, see how we're using UUID, I actually deleted it from the top. What I'm going to do here is completely get rid of this button, this add item button. We no longer need this. We're going to create a separate component for that anyways. So let's get rid of that. Okay, so now we don't get that error, and we won't see that button, but that's fine for now. So now let's try and delete milk, and there it goes. And you can see over here in our Redux DevTools, it called delete item, and it deleted the item from the state. You can see this diff tab is going to show us the difference. Once we deleted it, this was the difference. We no longer have this item. If I delete candy, that will go ahead, call delete item again. If I reload, it's going to come back because it's just static data inside of the reducer, but later on, it'll actually come from our back end. Okay, hopefully this is making sense. So the next thing I want to do, now that we've handled the delete, is create our ItemModal component to add an item. So under components, let's create a new file, and we'll call it ItemModal.js. Okay, so let's go ahead and import React and component. And that's going to come from React. And let's see, what else are we going to do here? Let's import all the stuff that we need from React Strap. Since we're building a modal, we have quite a few things to bring in. I'm actually going to grab them, paste them in. So that's from React Strap. All right. And then since this is going to be this is actually called a container. When you have, and this is just some more terminology to confuse you guys that don't know Redux. A container is basically a component that is hooked to Redux. If you're using Redux state inside of a React component, it's actually called a container. And sometimes you'll see people they'll have a folder called containers separate from the regular components. And I don't do that. If it's a component, I just put it in the component folder, whether it's dealing with Redux or not. It's just too much friggin' terminology. So let's import connect because we're going to be using Redux. And remember, connect comes from the React Redux package and does just that, connects them together. We're also going to have an add item action. So we'll import that even though we haven't created it yet, but we will. So we'll say add item. That's going to come from the actions. So /actions/item actions. All right, now we'll create our class called ItemModal, and it needs to extends component. And let's export default. Now remember, we're using connect. We're using Redux in this component, and we're using connect. So that's what we export. And then we put the actual component name here in the second parentheses. So Modal. All right, so let's see. We want to... We could copy from the React Strap website the Modal stuff, but I don't really want to do that. Basically, it just like the nav bar, you know how we had the is open state, we're going to have a Modal state value as well. So let's do, let's see, let's say state equals, and we want to say Modal, and that's going to be false. So basically this represents if the Modal is open or not. So it's false by default. And we're also going to have a form that will have the item name. So we also want to put that inside of our state. Okay, just because we have application state, actually I'm sorry, this should be name, doesn't mean that we shouldn't have any component state at all. Some things belong in the component, some things belong in the application, in the Redux state. In the case where you have a form, you're always going to want that form input to have a piece of state in the component. Okay, so we're going to have a name input, so we want that inside the component state. All right, now we're also going to have a toggle, just like we did with the nav bar. So for the toggle, we're going to say this dot set state, and it's going to be, we're going to do the same thing here. We're just going to set the modal value to whatever it's not. So this dot state dot modal, and that's it for the toggle. Now we're going to have a submit function, but we'll skip that for now. Let's do the render just so we can at least show the modal. We'll show the button, and then when we click that button, it'll toggle the modal. So in the render, let's do our return before I forget that again. And we're going to put in a div. Okay, so why isn't Emmet working? So inside this div, we want to have a button. And this is going to say, this is actually going to have, what should we have this say? Add item. And this is going to be the button that will open the modal. So it's going to take in a bunch of properties. It can take in a color. We'll say dark. I'm going to add a style to it just to move things down a little bit. So we'll just say margin bottom and set that to 2 rem. And then I'm going to do an on click, and the on click is going to call that toggle. It's going to toggle the modal. So this dot toggle. Okay, and that should do it for the button. Let's see. So under the button is where we want to put the actual modal. So let's say, oops, it should be modal. Okay, so the modal is going to take in a couple things. It's going to take in is open, and this is going to be set to whatever the modal state is. So this dot state dot modal, okay, which will either be true or false. And then we want toggle to be equal to this dot toggle, and that should do it for those properties. Now inside the modal, we're going to have a modal header, and this is also going to have a toggle, and that'll be equal to this dot toggle. And just to show you real quick, if you want to look at the documentation for React Strap and you look at components and you look at Modal, you'll see this looks very familiar. This is basically the same thing. You can see Modal is open, toggle. The header also has toggle. So this is where I got this code basically, except we're not going to have a footer and we're going to have a form inside the body. But that's you can see this is correct what I'm doing, even though it looks a little weird. So modal header has this dot toggle, and then let's close this up, modal header. And then what do we want in the header? Let's just say add to, we'll say add to shopping list. Okay, and under the header we want the modal body. Now in the modal body we're going to have a form. So we brought in a bunch of stuff for forms. We brought in form, form group, label, and input from React Strap, so we can use those. So we want to first do a form. Oops. Form, and this is going to take in an onSubmit event handler, and we're going to set that to a method called this.onSubmit. And then inside the form, we're going to have a form group. So, I mean, if you guys know anything about Bootstrap, you know, you just wrap, you have a form group, and then inside there you have an input and a label. That's exactly what we're doing. Instead of using divs, we're using these tags. Instead of using divs with classes. So form group, then we'll have a label. Label takes in a for attribute we'll call item. Let's see, close that, label, and let's say item. And then we want our input. So let's say input. Oops, that should be slash. And this is going to take in a bunch of properties. So this will take in type just like a regular input would, which will be text. It's going to take in name, which is going to be name, and this name should match whatever is in your state right here, this name. And then let's do an ID. So ID will say item, placeholder, we'll say add shopping item. And then we also need an onChange. Okay, so with React, when you have an input, you want to set this to a function, and it's usually called onChange. Doesn't have to be. This does, but you can call this whatever you want. We're going to call it onChange, and basically what happens is when we type inside this input, this will fire off. And then we want to then set the state of name to whatever is typed in this input. So let's go up here and add in onChange, and that's going to take in an event parameter. And we're going to say this dot set state. And then what I could do is just set name to the e-target value, because you can get whatever's typed in with e.target.value like that. But what I like to do is I like to put in a set of parentheses, and then, well, we would do that anyways, that's for the state. But instead of just saying name, I'm going to say e.target.name, which will be name because it refers to whatever this is, whatever this value is. Instead of hard coding name, I'm just getting it from the target. That way, if we had another input, we could still use this. We wouldn't have to create multiple onChange functions just to deal with, another input. So what we would want to do is set this to whatever the value is, whatever's typed in, which, like I said, we can get from e.target.value. Okay, so that should work. And let's just save that. And we haven't done the submit yet, but I just want to make sure that this actually shows up. So what we'll do is go into our app.js, and inside our app.js, we want to bring in our ItemModal component. So let's import ItemModal from components / ItemModal, and then we want to put that in right down here. Let's see, we have the app navbar, the shopping list, and yeah, we'll put it right here, ItemModal. All right, let's see what that looks like. All right, so that's what I thought would happen. I want to actually put these two components within a container, because see how this is pushed up against the side? So what I'll do is I'll bring in a container into our app.js from React-Strap. And then we can simply wrap. Let's see, let's wrap. We don't want the nav bar. We want to wrap these two in the container. There we go. All right, so let's go back. And can't resolve React-Strap. Did I spell it wrong? Yep. Okay, so now that's pushed over. Now if I click add item, there's our Modal. Okay, and I forgot the button, but you can see the Modal is actually working. So let's go back to ItemModal, and let's finish it up with adding an actual button to it. So we're going to go under the input, and let's put in a button. Let's see, we'll end this button, and let's just have it say add item, and we just have to add some properties to this button. So we're going to add a color of dark. I'm going to add a little margin to the top, so I'm going to say style. Let's do 2 rem. Whoops. And let's display it as a block, so we can just simply say block. And let's save. All right, so if we click add item, there we go. Now, if I put something in here and add, it's not going to do anything because our onSubmit hasn't been created. So that's what we want to do, because you can see the form, it's going to call this .onSubmit, but we haven't actually created that function. So let's add that now. So we'll go right here and we'll say onSubmit, and let's set that to an arrow function that takes in an event. Now, since it's a form, we need to prevent the actual form from submitting how it would naturally. So we do that with e.prevent default, like that. Okay, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a variable called new item. Now, we're not dealing with the back end yet. Remember, when we deal with the back end, MongoDB creates an ID on its own, so it's not up to us to create it. However, right now we're not dealing with Mongo yet, or the back end, so we have to create the ID. So what I'm going to do for now is just bring in UUID again. Okay, but we won't need this once we implement the back end because the ID will be created automatically. But for now, we're going to set the ID of this new item to UUID, like that. And then the name is going to come from the state. Okay, And remember, the state, when we type into the input, that updates this right here, this state.name. So once we have this new item, we then want to add, we'll say add item via add item action. Okay, so the way that we do that is this dot props dot add item and pass in new item. Okay, and then the last thing we want to do is actually close the modal. And we can do that by simply saying this dot toggle. Okay, I really like how the modal works with React Strap. It's really easy to open and shut and stuff like that, rather than, you know, you would use jQuery with just regular Bootstrap. So I think that's good. Let's save this. Now it's going to call the add item action. Okay, we brought it in, but we haven't actually created it yet. So let's go to item actions and let's create the add item. So what I'll do is copy this, the delete item, and change this to add item. Okay, now instead of an ID, it's going to take in the whole item, okay, which has the ID and the name. And then the type that we want to dispatch to the reducer is going to be add item. And then the payload is going to be the entire item this time. Okay, the payload can be whatever you want. In this case, it's going to be the item. So then we go to our reducer, and hopefully you're seeing the pattern here after we're adding all these. So in the reducer, we want to add a new case for add underscore item. And what we want to do here is return, let's say return, and we want the current state, so we use the spread operator and the state variable, and then we just do items, just like we did back in the component. We're going to say, instead of you know, item or whatever, we're doing action.payload. This is the item, the new item that comes in, and we also want to add our spread operator state.items, and this will just simply add it. Okay. And we use a spread operator like this because we can't actually mutate the state. We can't directly change it. We have to basically make a copy of it, and that's what this is doing. It's kind of hard to explain. So let's go back now and let's try it out. So hopefully it works. So we'll say add item, and let's say we need some, we don't have water on here, so we'll grab water, add item. This dot props add item is not a function. Let's see, it should be. Did I save that? And let's go here, add item from actions, and we called this right here, this dot props dot add item. Oh, see down here, we didn't take care of this. We did the connect, but we didn't add in the parameters that we want. So what we're going to do is we're going to pass in here map state to props, and then let's pass in here add item. Okay, and then I'm going to just bring in the item. I'm going to map the item state to props for this module as well, or for, I'm sorry, module for this component. So we'll say item state.item, just like we did in the other one. All right, so now it should work. Let's get water. There we go. And you can see it gets added and it gets the little fade effect. It also called the add item action over here. And it should have got, and if you look at the diff, it adds that new item here, which we can't really read, but you can see it has the ID and it's water. If we look at the state, it should be in there. And actually it's the first one, water. All right, so I think that we're just about ready for our backend. Okay, so everything is in the Redux store, and we're able to add to it. We're able to get the items that are in the Redux store, and we're able to delete them. So now we want to start to deal with the back end. We want to be able to get this stuff from our database rather than just, you know, right here. Because all we're doing is getting this stuff. We're adding to it in the UI, but it's not persisting anywhere. So now what we're going to do is in the actions file, instead of just doing return and then a type or whatever, we're going to make our requests here to the back end and then dispatch to the item reducer. All right, so we'll start that in the next video.